Welcome back to Strange Light Wizard Presents, a series that explores the deep and primal nature of fear as examined by and written by some of the most prolific authors. This was supposed to be a Halloween episode, but due to certain circumstances, I am not able to get it out until now. Anyways, much appreciated. Today's twisted tale of terror happens just to be a old standby of horror classic novel writing by Washington Irving, known solely as The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. I hope you enjoy. In the bosom of one of those spacious coves which indent the eastern shore of the Hudson, at that broad expansion of the river denominated by the ancient Dutch navigators the Tappan Zee, and where they always prudently shortened sail and implored the protection of St. Nicholas, there lies a small market town which is generally known by the name of Tarrytown. This name was given by the good housewives of the adjacent country from the inveterate propensity of their husbands to linger about the village tavern on market days. Not far from this village, perhaps about 2 miles, there is a little valley among high hills, which is one of the quietest places in the whole world. A small brook murmurs through it, and with the occasional whistle of a quail or tapping of a woodpecker, is almost the only sound that ever breaks the uniform tranquillity. From the listless repose of this place, the sequestered glen has long been known by the name of Sleepy Hollow. Some say that the place was bewitched during the early days of the Dutch settlement, others that an old Indian chief, the wizard of his tribe, held his powwows there before the country was discovered by Master Hendrik Hudson. Certain it is, the place still continues under the sway of some witching power that holds a spell over the minds of the descendants of the original settlers. They are given to all kinds of marvelous beliefs and are subject to trances and visions, frequently hear music and voices in the air. The whole neighborhood abounds with local tales, haunted spots, and twilight superstitions. The dominant spirit that haunts this enchanted region is the apparition of a figure on horseback without a head. It is said to be the ghost of a Hessian trooper whose head had been carried away by a cannonball in some nameless battle during the Revolutionary War, and who is ever seen by the country folk, hurrying along in the gloom of the night as if on the wings of the wind. Historians of those parts allege that the body of the trooper having been buried in the yard of a church at no great distance, the ghost rides forth to the scene of battle in nightly quest of his head, and that the rushing speed with which he sometimes passes along the hollow is owing to his being in a hurry to get back to the churchyard before daybreak. The spectre is known at all the country firesides by the name of the Headless Horseman of Sleepy Hollow. It is remarkable that this visionary propensity is not confined to native inhabitants of this little retired Dutch valley, but is unconsciously imbibed by everyone who resides there for a time. However wide awake they may have been before they entered that sleepy region, they are sure, in a little time, to inhale the witching influence of the air and begin to grow imaginative, to dream dreams and see apparition. In this place of nature there abode, some 30 years since, a worthy wight of the name of Ichabod Crane, a native of Connecticut, who tarried in Sleepy Hollow for the purpose of instructing the children of the vicinity. He was tall and exceedingly lank, with narrow shoulders, long arms and legs, hands that dangled a mile out of his sleeves, and feet that might have served for shovels. His head was small and flat at top, with huge ears, large green glassy eyes, and a long snipe nose, so that it looked like a weathercock perched upon his spindle neck, to tell which way the wind blew. To see him striding along on a windy day, with his clothes bagging and fluttering about him, one might have mistaken him for some scarecrow that eloped from a cornfield. His schoolhouse was a low building of one large room, rudely constructed of logs. It stood in a rather lonely but pleasant situation just at the foot of a woody hill, with a brook running close by, and a formidable birch tree growing at the end of it. From hence the low murmur of his pupils' voices conning over their lessons might be heard on a drowsy summer's day, interrupted now and then by the voice of the master in a tone of menace or command, or by the appalling sound of the birch as he urged some wrong-headed Dutch urchin along the flowery path of knowledge. All this he called doing his duty, and he never inflicted a chastisement without following it by the assurance, so consolatory to the smarting urchin, that he would remember it and thank him for the longest day he had to live. When school hours were over, Ichabod was even the companion and playmate of the larger boys, and on holiday afternoons would convoy some of the smaller ones home, who happened to have pretty sisters or good housewives from mothers, noted for the comforts of their cupboards. Indeed, it behooved him to keep on good terms with his pupils. The revenue arising from his school would have been scarcely sufficient to furnish him with daily bread, for he was a huge feeder, and though lank, had the dilating powers of an anaconda. To help out his maintenance he was, according to custom in those parts, boarded and lodged at the homes of his pupils a week at a time, thus going the rounds of the neighborhood with all his worldly effects tied up in a cotton handkerchief. This might not be too onerous for his rustic patrons. He assisted the farmers occasionally by helping them to make hay, mending the fences, and driving the cows home from pasture. He laid aside, too, all the dominant dignity with which he lorded it in the school, and became wonderfully gentle and ingratiating. He found favor in the eyes of the mothers by petting the children, particularly the youngest, and he would sit with the child on one knee and rock a cradle with his foot for whole hours together. In addition to his other vocations, he was the singing master of the neighborhood, and picked up many bright shillings by instructing the young folks in psalmody. Thus, by divers little makeshifts, the worthy pedagogue got on tolerably enough, and was thought, by all who understood nothing of the labor of headwork, to have a wonderfully easy life of it. The schoolmaster is generally a man of some importance in the female circle of a rural neighborhood, being considered a kind of idle, gentlemanlike personage of vastly superior taste and accomplishments to the rough country swains. How he would figure among the country damsels in the churchyard, between services on Sundays, gathering grapes for them from the wild vines that overran the surrounding trees, reciting for their amusement all the epitaphs on the tombstones, while the more bashful bumpkins hung sheepishly back, envying his superior elegance and address. He was, moreover, esteemed by the women as a man of great erudition, for he had read several books quite through, and was a perfect master of Cotton Mather's History of New England Witchcraft. It was often his delight, after his school was dismissed, to stretch himself on the clover bordering the little brook, and there con over old Mather's direful tales in the gathering dusk. Then, as he wended his way to the farmhouse where he happened to be quartered, every sound of nature, the boating cry of the tree-toad, the dreary hooting of the screech owl, fluttered his excited imagination. His only resource on such occasions was to sing psalm tunes, and the good people of Sleepy Hollow were often filled with awe at hearing his nasal melody floating along the dusky road. Another of his sources of fearful pleasure was to pass long winter evenings with the old Dutch wives as they sat spinning by the fire, with a row of apples roasting and spluttering along the hearth, and listen to their marvelous tales of ghosts and goblins, haunted bridges, and haunted houses, and particularly of the headless horseman. But if there was a pleasure in all this while snugly cuddling into the chimney-corner, it was dearly purchased by the terrors of his subsequent walk homeward. How often did he shrink with curdling awe at some rushing blast, howling among the trees of a snowy night, in the idea that it was the galloping Hessian of the hollow. All these, however, were mere phantoms of the dark. Daylight put the end to all these evils. He would have passed a pleasant life of it if his path had not been crossed by a being that causes more perplexity to mortal man than ghosts, goblins, and the whole race of witches put together, and that was a woman. Among the musical disciples who assembled one evening in each week to receive his instructions in psalmody was Katrina Van Tassel, the only child of a substantial Dutch farmer. She was a blossoming lass of fresh 18, plump as a partridge, ripe and melting and rosy-cheeked as one of her father's peaches, and was universally famed not merely for her beauty but her vast expectations. She was withal a little of a coquette, as might be perceived in her dress. She wore ornaments of pure yellow gold to set off her charms, and a provokingly short petticoat to display the prettiest foot and ankle in the country round. Ichabod Crane had a soft and foolish heart toward the sex, and it is not to be wondered at that so tempting a morsel soon found favor in his eyes, more especially after he had visited her in her paternal mansion. Old Baltus Van Tassel was a perfect picture of a thriving, contented, liberal-hearted farmer. He seldom, it is true, sent either his eyes or his thoughts beyond the boundaries of his own farm. but within those everything was snug, happy, and abundant. The Von Tassel stronghold was situated on the banks of the Hudson in one of those green, sheltered, fertile nooks in which the Dutch farmers are so fond of nestling. A great elm tree spread its broad branches over it, at the foot of which bubbled up a spring of the softest and sweetest water. Hard by the farmhouse was a vast barn, every window and crevice of which seemed bursting forth with treasures of the farm. Rows of pigeons were enjoying the sunshine on the roof. Sleek, unwieldy porkers were grunting in the repose and abundance of their pens. A stately squadron of snowy geese were riding in an adjoining pond, convoying whole fleets of ducks. Regiments of turkeys were gobbling through the farmyard. The pedagogue's mouth watered as he looked upon the sumptuous promise of luxurious winter fare. In his devouring mind's eye he pictured himself every roasting pig running about with an apple in its mouth. The pigeons were snugly put to bed in a comfortable pie and tucked in a coverlet of crust. As the enraptured Ichabod fancied all this, as he rolled his great green eyes over the fat meadowlands, the rich fields of wheat, rye, buckwheat, and Indian corn, and the orchard burdened with ruddy fruit, which surrounded the warm tenement of Van Tassel, his heart yearned after the damsel who was to inherit these domains, and his imagination expanded with the idea of how they might be readily turned into cash, and the money invested in immense tracts of wild lands, and shingle palaces in the wilderness. His busy fancy already presented him the blooming Katrina with a whole family of children, mounted on top of a wagon loaded with household trumpery, and he beheld himself bestriding a pacing mare with a colt at her heels, setting out for Kentucky, Tennessee, or Lord knows where. When he entered the house, the conquest of his heart was complete. It was one of those spacious farmhouses with high-ridged but low-sloping roofs built in the style handed down from the first Dutch settlers, the projecting eaves forming a piazza along the front. From the piazza the wondering Ichabod entered the hall, which formed the center of the mansion. Here rows of resplendent pewter, ranged on a long dresser, dazzled his eyes. In one corner stood a huge bag of wool, ready to be spun. Ears of Indian corn and strings of dried apples and peaches hung in gay festoons along the wall, and a door left ajar gave him a peep into the best parlor, where the claw-footed chairs and dark mahogany tables shone like mirrors. Mock oranges in conch shells decorated the mantelpiece. Strings of various colored bird eggs were suspended above it, and a corner cupboard, knowingly left open, displayed immense treasures of old silver and well-mended china. And there we have it, the first half of The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. If you enjoyed this story, give it a like. If you like my work and want to see more of it, hit the subscribe bell and hit notifications so you can be the first to know when my videos come out next. Thank you very much for listening, and sorry again for the late upload. I want to get back to the regular way of doing it, which is I record during my recording day and then usually have it posted by Friday. Anyways, thank you again for listening, and I look forward to seeing you in the next half of The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. Goodbye.